In this video, I'm picking up on some of the things that are articulated in part 1, namely the Theaetetus 200. We're talking about the third definition, knowledge is true belief, jury discussion. So I've talked a little bit about that. So we're now in part 2. Now, if you recall from part 1, we had some notions, some distinctions that were brought in, like the distinction between persuasion and teaching. So I want to bring up that a little bit more, talk about it a little bit more in depth, and just to make a few reflections and wrap up, shall we say, the discussion of the third definition of knowledge, which, remember, is knowledge is true belief. All right, so we talked about the time restriction, that really, remember, courts are, you got the water clock and you only got so much time. And the time restriction is really the big problem, supposedly. That there's not enough time to learn truth and have knowledge, so that juries, if they had more time, like if you had a giant water clock, I don't know, water clock the size of the ocean or whatever. But in principle, it's just a problem of time. More time to learn in the jury setting, and you'd come to the truth. And Socrates says, I don't really think so. But it's still not a bad thing to reflect on, the time factor, because remember, sometimes reflecting on how things go south or go awry can help us put us on a more logical path towards the truth. So let's think about this. It might be the case that knowledge is just true belief, our third definition, and the right conditions. So like a bigger water clock, or all we have to do is to find the right conditions and juries would have truth. So that's a possible avenue for exploration. And this, as a matter of fact, is a dominant way of talking about knowledge in the 20th century. For instance, the famous Ernst Gettier wrote an article, around 50-ish years ago, and which he talks about knowledge as true belief under the right conditions. And he has all kinds of problems with it. And sometimes people think that Plato embraced this, but I want to show that no, he doesn't, because he'll talk about this in the next section. So that's our fourth definition of knowledge. So this is a little bit of a jump ahead, but it stems out of this notion of reflecting on the time restriction in courts. So we'll see this in a little bit more detail in a future video. So stay tuned for that. And the second thing that we saw in our jury discussion was that the second-hand problem, shall we say. It's just not good enough. Doesn't matter how much time you have. If you're not an eyewitness to something, forget it. Now, this connection of learning something and really learning it and having knowledge about something and being closely associated, like an eyewitness to it, that's a philosophical theme, or perhaps I should say a pedagogical theme that runs through the history of philosophy. And Plato does, shall we say, link this up earlier in the dialogue. That is the link, what? The link between, something being very close to the soul, and that's really knowledge. And as a matter of fact, it's so close, we saw in our midwife discussion, remember way back at the beginning of the dialogue, that knowledge is ultimately going to be something that Socrates was to bring out of you, not put in you. So knowledge, ideas, these are things that are deeply associated with us. They're not things that we just come about by, shall we say, gathering through a description of them, a description by others. No, it's a real close encounter with the ideas ourselves. We're eyewitnesses. That's how you have knowledge. In the Republic, the philosopher in the cave, he gets out, she gets out, doesn't really say if it's male or female, doesn't really matter, but the person gets out of the cave and has a full and direct contact with ideas. And so that is where knowledge is this real deep direct contact. Okay, so we have this in other dialogues, both other dialogues than the Theaetetus, as well as in the Theaetetus, that the second-hand problem is a serious problem. It's not just time, it's this second-hand nature. You find this also reflected in St. Augustine. He talks about it in his work on the teacher. When he says, well, what's learning? Well, really, learning is done by the individual. It's someone who has to take something for him or herself and really come into close contact with it. And some modern pedagogy says just that. Really, to have students learn is they have to grapple with the thing themselves. They shouldn't just listen to a lecture. So that's why you don't just listen to me. You have to go and grapple with the text, that is the Theaetetus, yourself. These lectures are to help introduce you, but they shouldn't take the place of you, shall we say, as Socrates in a good old Greek metaphor of wrestling. You should wrestle with the text yourself. And that's what Augustine says quite often in On the Teacher. So the dissemination, all I can do is produce some beliefs, perhaps, hopefully true ones, about the Theaetetus and the discussion, but I can't produce knowledge in you. If you really want to have knowledge, you have to go and encounter it for yourself. So this sort of haphazard notion of secondhand and you can gather true beliefs, I'm going to look at it again in a little more detail, but that's been something that various philosophers have spoken about and said, well, that's fine, but that's not really knowledge. Knowledge isn't just sort of this collection of true beliefs you've gathered up as you go along the way. As a matter of fact, that can end up in some bad ways. Just jumping ahead, Jacques Ellul talks about that, but I'll get back to that in a minute. So the conventional teacher is sort of an external issue. It's an external object to the student, just simply creating the conditions to help learning happen. But the student has to engage and do it for him or herself. So real learning then is always a direct encounter. So think of it this way, real learning so the real learning of whatever is always a direct, it's a direct encounter. With what? With the subject material, whatever it happens to be in that case. So John Locke, whom we will see much more of in this course, John Locke, the great British thinker, centuries after Plato. Stay tuned, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to Locke later. But Locke also expresses this idea, or shall we say, of what real learning is, what knowledge ultimately is, because in his work too, that we're going to read, he's deeply concerned with what knowledge is. And he too wants to separate it from things like accidental possessions of truth, same way that Plato talks about here in the Theaetetus. And John Locke says that, knowledge is a real encounter and coming to grips with something, wrestling with something, similar kinds of metaphors. And it's not simply something that can be passed around. You can't just take knowledge and just, I'm passing knowledge over to you as if it were just a collection of facts. Because you can think of it this way, Locke wouldn't have had this metaphor certainly at his fingertips. He wouldn't have, nor would Plato. But, it's a database. Knowledge, we sometimes talk about it as knowledge, but really is it? Seems to be problematic if you just say that knowledge is stuff that can be written down or encoded in pieces of paper or some electronic format. And Locke says those can be true statements, but they're not really knowledge. And I'm going to modernize a little bit of this. So John Locke says you could learn, and I put learn in scare quotes here, you can sort of collect or learn or whatever term you want, but you really shouldn't say it's the full-throated, full-blooded notion of learning when all you've done is collected a bunch of true statements. That's not really knowledge. And to sort of help give an idea of this is you consider, I'm going to, again, use another image, an idea that Locke did not have at his fingertips. Think about this famous little equation of Einstein's, E is equal to mc squared. Most of us have seen that somewhere, right? Energy has something to do with the mass, and this little c stands for the speed of light squared. Lovely, beautiful, simple little formula. It's actually not all that simple, but it looks simple, and most people say, yeah, I kind of get it. Energy is connected to mass and the speed of light, and people say that they sort of have a truth of Einstein's. Pretty nice to say you have a truth of Einstein's, but do you really? Right? Do you really understand it? It's a truth that you've just collected along the way. Do you understand where that comes from? Do you understand the other kind of physics that it was opposed to and how it relates to and doesn't relate to earlier forms of physics? So it's one thing to say that you've just got a true statement in your pocket and you can trot it out, and maybe it makes you look good to say it in certain contexts, but do you really have knowledge of that? And Locke and Plato would say, not really. Now, I mentioned Jacques Ellul, just as an aside. He's kind of a fun guy because he analyzed the notion of propaganda. And while that's quite fascinating in and of itself, I just bring him up because Jacques Ellul says that one of the great dangers of education is that you can get a false, and it's kind of a false education, is that you can accumulate tons and tons of secondhand, of truths in a secondhand way. They're not secondhand truths, but truths acquired in a secondhand kind of way, like the E is equal to mc squared. And you can think, because the more educated you are, the more you accumulate these truths secondhand, you can think you have much more knowledge than you really do. And that's something we have to be careful of. And the real reason we have to be careful of it is because you have all these truths that you've just sort of accidentally gathered, scooped up, hoovered up along the way, and you have many opinions based on these. And if you don't really understand what you're talking about, and you base your opinions on things you don't clearly understand, but they're still true, you can produce all kinds of strange conclusions. So you can start from true premises in your argument, and because you really don't understand what the premises are, you can go from a bunch of solid truths to some pretty questionable, dubious conclusions. So beware of this, Jacques Ellul says. Beware of having a mass amount of education and you can still come up with terrible ideas, even though you're starting from true premises. All right, so where does this lead us? As I said, just some reflections on this, that the time restriction can lead us in some sort of direction towards true belief being fleshed out by right conditions. And just as a sneak preview, we will use, this is a logos, and we'll look at what logos means, but it's really some kind of specific conditions that Plato or Socrates will try to unpack, and that's not going to work either. Sorry, there's the, I gave away, but the examination of it is worthwhile. So the first one on the time restriction leads to a fruitful examination, more deeply on reflection on what is knowledge, and so does this one, because it really says that, you know, true learning, true knowledge, you know, the real sense of knowledge as opposed to a kind of superficial idea of knowledge, it comes through this deep and direct encounter. And of course, that's going to relate back, I'll leave you to think about this, but that is going to tie very nicely in with our master argument where Socrates said that a thesis is not going to work because of the disjointed nature of the senses, and that it's really the soul that's a kind of unifier. So a lot of these things that are swirling around in the background, they do link up, but Plato, being the master dramatist, he forces us to engage with all of the ideas to try and put them together ourselves. All right, so in the end, what can we say? Well, we can say something like this. Just having true beliefs, right, your grab bag of true beliefs, they're all true statements. They're all true judgments. They're true beliefs. You got a bunch of them. Nobody's debating that. But there's an accidental nature to it. You just kind of go and you grab these things, and would you say you really have knowledge? Here's another way to think of it. Let's say, and we do this in everyday conversation. If someone says something that is true, but we often say, how do you know that? So if I said to you something like, right now while I'm recording this video, on top of the building that I'm in right now, way up on the top, there are 3 birds, and they're walking around and they're building, a couple of birds are building a nest. Let's say I say that. And let's say that it is, in fact, if we had a video camera up there, we could turn it on and bang, we find out right now that it is the case, in fact, that there's some birds up there building a nest. And then you could say to me, well, okay, you said the birds were building the nest. We looked at the video and we can, yeah, you're right. It was building the nest. And then you ask me, how did you know that? You didn't go up there or whatever. How did you do that? And I say, I just guessed. In other words, I just said it. I could have equally said there's no birds up there or whatever, but I just said there's birds up there building a nest, and it happened to be the case that they are. So there's a very accidental nature between my saying the truth and the truth of the situation. There doesn't seem to be any real connection. Otherwise, I could say, or you could say to me, well, you got it right, but did you really know that there were birds up there building the nest? And that seems to be something our intuitions would say, nah, you were lucky, you got it right, you guessed right. So even if you guess and you get it right, even if you, shall we say, guess the truth, we still would say, you have a true belief, but that's not knowledge. Now we're opening up the question of knowledge, not just involving belief out of his, up from his thesis, not just involving a certain part of belief, like not false, but true. So we got the true belief bit, but now we're kind of forced back. There seems to be something missing. We need the right conditions. It's some sort of intimate connection or something that links our true belief directly. It can't be accidental. Right? Because you could guess the truth, but that doesn't mean that you know it. Why do we insist on this? Why do we say, yeah, you guessed it, but that's not knowledge? Because we could. We could simply say, you know what, guessing the truth, that's good enough for knowledge. I don't know, I'm just going to say that. But that seems to be problematic. That seems to be something that we deeply reject. And why do we reject it? Is it on a great rational ground or whatever? Maybe, but it also seems to be something in our intuitions that just blocks us from saying, yeah, knowledge is something you could just guess. No, knowledge has to somehow, to use a more modern expression, knowledge is somehow something that tracks truth. It's not just a haphazard relationship with it. So when I say I know something, it's not just a production of a guess. Even if I say something that's correct, guessing it doesn't seem to be sufficient. We demand not only that knowledge is true, of course it has to be related to the truth, but it can't just be haphazardly related. Knowledge has to be intimately linked with the truth. And what we're getting out of this discussion is it's got to be intimately linked in the right conditions and intimately linked in the term it's not bounded by time. It's bounded, if it's bounded by anything, it's going to be a direct contact. So that sums up roughly what's going on in the jury discussion, and our the third definition is knowledge as true belief. We're now going to look more deeply at the next thing that we seem to need, something more than just true belief. That is, episteme is not just a true belief, but it has some kind of right conditions. And the next one is, what are these right conditions? And this is going to be a discussion of what Socrates calls a logos, or sometimes it's just called the right conditions, or sometimes it's called an account. So our next definition, our fourth definition, will be knowledge is true belief plus some kind of logos or account. But that's a story for the next video. Stay tuned.